Good evening, everyone. I'm Katie Stover, Director of Reader Services for the Kansas City Public Library, and I am delighted to introduce Taylor Brorby for Boys and Oil, Growing Up Gay in a Fractured Land. We have copies for sale in the lobby, and Taylor will be signing after the event, so please pick one up then. You know, fractured is an apt term. We live in fractured times. And North Dakota is fractured by drilling, climate change, agriculture. Families can fracture us as well. And Taylor talks about this in his searing memoir. It's an accessible, compelling story told in emotional language that soars. Think of it as half coming out memoir, half environmental memoir. Taylor is an essayist and poet, thus the elegant language. This is his first full-length work, and last night he learned Boys in Oil is now a New York Times editor's choice. That's a pretty big honor. His work has appeared in the Huffington Post, Orion Magazine, and North Atlantic Review. Please prepare yourselves to be utterly charmed and captivated by Taylor Brorby.
Well, hello. Hi. Can you hear me all right? Yep. Excellent. I'm looking forward to being here. It's so great to be back in, though it's not the home state. I was telling people backstage, I ate barbecue in I'm moving to Salt Lake City, in St. Louis last night, sitting by the Missouri River, which I have not seen in 3 years. It's my home river. Weeping, eating great barbecue, and so to spend 2 nights near the Missouri River feels really nice for me. It's a central focus in this book. I'm looking forward to bringing you into the process of at least what I think I was trying to do. If you ask most writers, we have no clue what in the hell we're up to when we're writing. It's just sort of hold your breath, write like hell, and see what happens. But this book really came out of a perspective, just to give you a little bit of the backstory here. When I was growing up, I was looking for a book on a bookshelf that didn't exist. To my understanding, there is no memoir about growing up on the northern Great Plains or in the Intermountain West from a gay perspective. It's not there. I'm very happy to say that it now is. It doesn't mean that it's an easy story or it's a comfortable story. But when I've asked most friends, name a great piece of literature with an LGBTQ perspective of the American West, everyone comes back and says, Brokeback Mountain. And I'm not sure if you've read Brokeback Mountain, which is slightly different than the movie version. It's a 28-page harrowing short story. It's fiction, but it feels more true to my understanding of the region that I call home than most nonfiction even. It seems almost cliche that, of course, one of the main characters gets murdered by the end of the story, or it's surmised that the character's murdered. And I thought, what's it mean if you grow up in a 13-state region getting told in a piece of literature what you already know to be true, if what you're keeping as a secret is a life and death secret? As I say in the book, the shortest, most life-changing sentence you can say is, I am gay. At least when you tell people I love you, even if they reject you, they're not going to, hopefully, kill you or try to, convert you or send you to therapy, which is a type of torture. It's a harrowing thing to grow up in rural America as a gay person. I would love to be speaking in the past tense here, but from my vantage point, that still seems to be the case. In my home state, just last year, a transgender girl murdered herself, killed herself, because of how isolated she felt. A few years ago, 2 girls in Devil's Lake, North Dakota, basically made a Romeo and Juliet suicide pact. They were 11 and 12. One blew her head off and the other one hanged herself. It's a very bad story. We're living in a time of very bad stories. My book isn't necessarily a hopeful book. I don't really know happy endings, to be honest. We want that for some reason in America. We hope things become easier or better. But the end of most stories involves death. We're all going to die, which isn't a happy thing to think about. So why do we crave happy endings? For instance, one of the things you'll find in this book, on my oldest nephew's 5th birthday, I was outed by my aunt to my parents. I was leaving for seminary, going out east. It's not so much that I wanted to be a pastor. I just grew up in a trailer house in a county without a stoplight, 9 miles from where Lewis and Clark spent more time on their westward journey than any other place, near Fort Mandan in North Dakota. It's where we would launch our boat to catch walleye, these beautiful emerald fish that are so great to eat as well. It felt that the world was big, and there was a tiny little detail about me that I wasn't revealing in that home place, the I am gay part of my identity. And so I was the first in my family to finish college. It was incredible. I grew up with parents who loved me, who taught me how to sketch. They were all state athletes, and somehow they got this odd little boy who loved oil painting and practicing saxophone and wanted to go to college, and college cracked me open. It didn't change me, I would say. This is sometimes the worry, I think, when you're the first in your family. Oh, it changed you. It's more that it reaffirmed me. College was where I ate my first falafel, because I'm not sure if you've been to North Dakota recently. It is the least visited state in the country, in case you were wondering. But most food is white, and black pepper is considered spicy where I come from. So the idea of having something like an avocado for a little boy who, again, grew up in a county without a stoplight, felt like going to the moon. What is this thing called a falafel? Who knows? Things like this. And so college cracked me open in these incredible ways, not only about stories. It's where I first encountered this writer you might have heard of, Louise Erdrich. It turns out she's from my home state. She's the first writer I can really actively remember reading who was still alive. In high school, we read a lot of dead people, which is important. It's important to know your history and things like this. It's also important, I think, on some level to feel seen or affirmed in literature. Knowing where you come from is worthy of sentences that sing. And that was part of the impetus for this book, is to try to sing like the Symphony of the Prairie, as I understand it. But it's a lonely existence if it takes you until you're 18 to understand that your state might have produced a writer. If we were to survey the audience, chances are after Louise, I'm not quite convinced we would get more authors' names. Maybe you would say Chuck Klosterman. Maybe you would say Deborah Marquardt. Maybe Larry Wywoody, who just recently died. But North Dakota is not known as a hotbed for producing literary writers, in case you're curious. And so part of that, of going to college, was to learn that there were these other stories and that someone had made it. Someone had written a book called The Red Convertible or The Master Butcher's Singing Club. And I thought that was incredible. It was the first time I saw a birth date for an author with a dash without a death date. And that just did something in my brain. It wasn't that I wanted to be a writer. I was going to go to seminary. I was going to go and get a PhD and become an English professor. But then after that, August 5th of 2010, My aunt called my parents after my nephew's birthday, and she said to my mother, "I'm worried Taylor might be gay." Now, worried is an interesting word in that sentence. Not, "I think Taylor might be gay," or "I even hope Taylor might be gay." You know, that would be a great perspective to live into. It's that earlier in the summer, I'd been sharing online articles that the church I grew up in, the Evangelical Lutheran Church in America, what's known as the ELCA, has started ordaining openly gay and lesbian clergy. In my family, which I think is indicative of a certain mentality, you only say what you believe. So there's not really a distinction or the exercise of arguing an opposite viewpoint just to argue it. What you say is what you believe. So for someone like me, for instance, in my family, why would we care about the Black Lives Matter movement? We're not black. We're Germans from Russia, now called Ukrainians, and Norwegians. We're about as white can get here. So there's not sort of this imaginative leap. And part of that, I think, is from a lack of reading, particularly fiction. We know fiction increases empathy. And I had thought about writing this book as fiction because things are at risk when you write nonfiction. People's stories get told. You have to change names or genders or locations to protect people, but to still serve a story. But part of it was that a story I was not yet ready to tell, "I am gay," was taken away from me to two important people, my parents. So for the first time, my parents knocked on my door. I was back home working a food supply warehouse job. Yes, even tiny little gay boys learn how to drive forklift. And this is what I was doing, unloading 50-pound blocks of mozzarella cheese 30 feet up in the air, having a grand old time. And they knocked on my door for the first time. Now, my parents, again, just to remind you, lovely, supportive, did their best. One was a graveyard shift welder, my father. My mother grew up and spent her entire career in a place that I want to tell you about in a little bit, at Minn Kota Power in center North Dakota. I grew up swimming in a lake that never freezes in North Dakota because its water is used to cool coal-fired turbine engines of the power plant that put bread and butter on my childhood table. My parents knocked on my door. This is after supporting their son who wanted to be a symphony conductor, who was going to college to crack open his brain and learn new things. They would come to my jazz recitals. They would show up for art openings at the county fair and things like this. And then they knocked on my door for the first time and came into my bedroom after I had gone to bed because I had an early morning shift. I had to be to work unloading those 50-pound blocks of mozzarella cheese at 5 in the morning. And my mom came and sat down on my bed. My dad, who though he's my height, has an even bigger, boomier voice than I do. He's kind of like Hulk Hogan in many ways. He's just a presence. He stood in the doorway, his arms folded, and did not speak the entire time. And my mom had told me how my aunt had called and said, "I'm worried Taylor might be gay." And I asked her why she thought that. And she said, "Because you've been posting articles online about clergy in the Lutheran Church who are openly gay being ordained." And I thought in that split moment, just lie. You're going out to Princeton, wait until you have a stable boyfriend, or, I come from a part of the world where you have to get married as soon as you start dating. Wait until you're ready to get married, even though it wasn't legal yet in the country. And just lie. You can tell them later you'll have about 2,000 miles of comfortable distance between you. It'll be a little easier then. But I didn't lie. And I said that shortest, most life-changing sentence. "I am gay." And my mother fired back, "But we don't know any gay people." I mean, think about that just for a minute. I don't know what was. My mother, who loved me, who we both share being a type 1 diabetic, who supported my art obsession. I drew Jafar from Disney's Aladdin more hours than I care to tell you when I was growing up. I was like hell-bent on getting Jafar perfect and becoming a Disney animator as a child. My mother found all of these things incredible. And I thought that was so interesting in that moment that the boy she raised, who is now a young man, sitting in front of her, could not possibly be gay. And I said to her, "You lived with a gay person for 18 years." And it looked like I had dissolved my mother. It was a real scary moment when I think back on that right now. I haven't thought in those ways in quite some time. I was glad I was that quick-witted, but I thought, you love me for who I am in all these great ways. And now it's as if saying I liked Rocky Road ice cream compared to, I don't know, grasshopper or something, mint chocolate chip. But this was a big deal. I left for seminary. I only stayed there for 8 days, trying to memorize ancient Greek, alpha, beta, gamma, delta, epsilon, zeta, eta, theta, iota, kappa, lambda. Mama's little baby loves shorten and is great for memorizing foreign languages. And I had a mental breakdown. I left Princeton. I moved back in with my parents in Bismarck, North Dakota, next to the Missouri River. And every other weekend I would go down to the Twin Cities of Minneapolis, St. Paul, where I had friends, and I would bawl on their futons to other 22-year-olds. And a college professor saved me. She opened up her basement, said, "We need to get you out of there. It's not a safe place to be." And that's part of it. That's not where the story in this book ends, but it's so much the genre of memoir. Memoir is the great sort of bastion for abuse narratives, for addiction and recovery narratives. And I'm bringing you into sort of the most traumatic moment of my life so far, other than when people oversalt their soup or things like this. But it's an attempt to now back away from that, because what I hope I've done in this memoir is something more than that. What you'll encounter in this is passages that I hope sing and celebrate the natural beauty of the prairie that I grew up on, the prairie that is drastically and direly under threat right now. The prairie, I think, or suggest in this work, is the most intimidating landscapes. People who love mountains normally don't last long as my friends, because I just go, wow, I'm not that impressed by height. As you can tell, I'm a small man. And so height doesn't really impress me much, and I'd like to wear my glasses to see you a little better, but they fog up so quickly. But the prairie is the most biodiverse bioregion we have on the planet. A square mile can support somewhere north of 3,000 species of insect, which is just insects. This is more than the Amazon can do. The Amazon looks weak and piddly compared to my home prairie, which I love knowing. But we can clear-cut forests, we can blow up mountains, we can dam rivers. But what we try to do to the prairie, insofar as I've understood it, we try to plow it. We try to poison it with monocultures. I was driving across southern Illinois and the great state of Missouri today, which has high green and low green, as you might know, corn and soybeans, which becomes biofuel. We pull coal from the prairie. It intimidates us. It's why we have to call this vast region we're all in flyover country, because it's incredibly humbling. It's where you're exposed. It's a diverse bioregion that thrives on its diversity, but we've insulted it by creating monocultures. And that's part of, I think, this book as well, is to try to remind people that rural America isn't just white, straight, and conservative. There might be more to the story than that. There might be more interesting questions we might look at about what multiple generations of fossil fuel extractive economies do to, in particular, men, and then byproducts, families. North Dakota is always ranked first in the drunkest state in the country. And North Dakotans aren't fun drunks, just to be clear. I think if I were to go to a bar in my home county with a woman and put my hand on her thigh, that wouldn't be crossing really any lines. Now, if I did that with a man, I'm not sure what would happen. I don't like thinking about that. But I don't think that's just in North Dakota. I think that's in Missouri. I think that's in Kansas. I think that's in rural California. This is the weight of, I think, the moment that we're in, that things have really shrunk from the perspective of what it means to be an openly gay person. If North Dakota's story is telling young queer youth that the best option you have is to shoot your head off or hang yourself, that's a very insulting story to the culture that I hope we're trying to build in this country, one that I think would turn on, as my friend Wendell Berry says, affection or love, or would increase topsoil instead of letting it blow away on the wind. And this book came out of that perspective of it is incredibly lonely to grow up in the least visited state in the country, and to not think that art can come out of here. Because part of the story of North Dakota, just to bring you deeply into it, it is the testing ground for the worst ideas in the country. The genocide of Native Americans that results in reservations. I grew up a half hour north of where General George Armstrong Custer last lived before he went west and had the worst day of his life. But he was also a little bit queer. In the journals that some of the cavalry kept, they'd call him effeminate. He would wear crushed purple velvet leather kid riding gloves. He perfumed his hair. I love that. It's a fabulous tale for a horrible human. So we have Custer on one hand, the genocide of brown-skinned people. We have the damming of the Missouri River, which we might say is for hydraulic electricity, is also to target agricultural river bottom lands for the Mandan, Hidatsa, and Arikara tribes. North Dakota is also where Sitting Bull surrendered his rifle, which is the effective bowing down of native nations to the United States government. The Red River Valley in the east is one monoculture of sugar beets, which America is addicted to. We love our sugar. My home area is where coal mining happens. To the west is where hydraulic fracking happens. In the north, at the height of the Cold War, North Dakota farmers had their sunflower fields plowed to then plunder Minutemen missile silos, that is nuclear warheads, to put a target on Russia. Had North Dakota seceded at the height of the Cold War, it would have been the third most powerful nuclear nation on the planet. This is just a brief overview of what my home state has to offer, and I can't take it all on in one book. There's too much. It's a grand buffet, a smorgasbord of trauma that now is resulting, by the end of the book, that home power plant, Minn Kota Power, you can look this up later, Project Tundra, what a sexy name, cold and frigid. What is being proposed right now is a technology called carbon capture and storage, which will impact every state from Maine to California. In North Dakota, the home power plant in Oliver County, where none of you have been, now is the hinge point for the habitability of the planet, because what carbon capture and storage seeks to do is to liquefy carbon dioxide from power plants, whether they're coal or natural gas or biodiesel, so think of Iowa up here, just north of us, is planning to unleash a pipeline revolution going back to my home state of North Dakota that has agreed to open up 6,000 feet under Earth's surface is the perfect geologic formation called caprock, where we will then liquefy emissions on site of these power plants, turning carbon dioxide into liquefied carbon dioxide, pump it through pipelines that will never break, and then push it 6,000 feet under the Earth's surface where it will, to the best of our knowledge, stay forever. But if liquid carbon dioxide, meets with moisture, it becomes carbonic acid, which you and I know what that does. It's fatal to us. It in fact stops engines from functioning. So should a pipeline rupture, should there be moisture in the air, you'll have a carbonic acid cloud, and the EMTs aren't coming to help you. And this is at the site, at a place, at the lake that never freezes. It's a grand horror story. And though it's not said in the book, part of the impetus for writing this book is that my half-baked theory is that if you have multiple generations of people who exist by destroying the very place that they live, how does that not breed a type of violence, even if it's latent? It might be violence to themselves. I grew up with a man in my small town of 600 who was an alcoholic, who lived in a house without electricity or running water. And he had all these brown specks on his forearms. And when I was maybe about 8, I asked my dad, I said, "Dad, why does he have those specks?" And my dad said, "Oh, well, you know why that is. Every day he goes down to the bar, but he can't afford, the Lord Calvert that he loved. And so he allowed coal miners to sizzle out their cigarettes on his skin. And that would buy him a little tincture of Lord Calvert." This is what industrial capitalism does in America. People in my hometown would believe that they're keeping your power on, and maybe for a time that's the way we knew it should happen. But it's a very different time. And there's a lot at risk right now in terms of what the planet will look like going forward, what it looks like right now. We've got massive flooding. I don't have to tell you, but yesterday when I was driving through Kentucky, their corn isn't even as tall as I am. It's charred. It's brown. It's terrifying to me as someone who hopes to live for hopefully another 50 years or so. But what this book tries to do is to bring you into that landscape that I'm trying to narrate for you now, but through a single narrative of a little boy who wanted to create beautiful things in the wake of so much destruction, even if he didn't know what that destruction looked like. In 1995, there's a scene in this book. I was 7, going on 8, but on Earth Day, there was this incredible 1990s cartoon. Now, all of you who balk at cartoons, I'm about to just sink your argument here. Imagine little me, about this tall, with Batman pajamas and a little Velcro cape, scurrying down the stairs to turn on the television. And there's this show about a wallaby named Rocco with his best friend, who's a boy, named Heifer, which always made me giggle growing up in agricultural land, about being like, you have a girl's name, but you're a boy. I thought, oh my God, gender identity in the 90s, like losing my mind here. And it was the first musical version of this cartoon. It wasn't a musical. But the local corporation named Conglamo was polluting the local water source. And the recycling site, the dump, was so full, no one was recycling. So there were these songs, which I still remember. It would go, RECYCLE, recycle, CONSEREV, conserve. Don't you POLLUTE, pollute the river, sky, or sea, or else you're going to get what you deserve. And the whole narrative illustrated these things called fluorocarbons that love the atmosphere and to chomp. They come from a variety of places, like styrofoam containers and aerosol cans. They love to eat the ozone. It's our favorite dessert. And if you don't have an ozone, then the sun can really hurt. And at the end of that cartoon, I looked out our big bay window in this tiny town of 600, and there was puffing the smokestack for the power plant where my mother worked. Something in me was triggered that day. The lesson was learned that maybe not all was right. I thought it was so cool originally to grow up swimming in a lake that never freezes. And after that day, I didn't swim in that lake ever again. I would still go fishing there, but there was something that that little cartoon taught me, that the lie we were all living in, because we had to put food on the table, was the only way of earning a living unless you were a farmer or a rancher. That there was some sort of community agreement that we were not going to admit maybe what we were doing to ourselves because there weren't other options. To move is a great privilege. To have money that you want to leave home, we shouldn't want to leave home. And that's part of where this book comes out of. I haven't lived in North Dakota since I was 18, but it's the landscape that I return to always. I don't suffer from writer's block, knock on wood, because I go back to the Missouri River, the bend where we always launched our boat, if I'm stuck with my writing, and write sentences about how the cottonwood leaves shimmer like silver coins, or that there might be a bald eagle standing in sharp profile, or that I could pull out a great pallid sturgeon, a ghost that's 70 million years old that lives in that river. That's a little bit what I think I'm up to in this book. There are these dual strains between the natural environment, the extractive economies of the northern Great Plains, while having your guide be maybe the least suspecting person you could imagine, a little gay boy who really wanted to read books, who really wanted to paint beautiful things, who in fact never wanted to leave home. And that's one of the hard things I think some of the stories we're still telling rural queer kids by details or by the stories we're giving them. To survive, you have to leave home. That's a really bad story to grow up hearing. And I don't know how to change that. I don't think my book really gives us a way to change that. I think it's just trying to share a narrative of trying to find safety where you are. But you'll encounter stories of me getting assaulted outside of a bar when I go back home to live in the Bakken oil boom, to interview landowners impacted by the oil boom about how they feel about the water being poisoned or about the oil spill on the neighbor's land, or the risk of spending a summer writing, working on this very book out on the Olympic Peninsula, which is the logging capital of the world, another extractive economy, and getting followed back to the home that I was renting from a guy who was recovering from trauma in the Vietnam War that I did not know, but had followed me for 15 miles back on very windy roads. And this is the condition of being gay in this country. It's to never feel like you can take a full deep breath and relax. And part of that is, I hope the book that you hopefully will all read is that it's not tied up. It's sort of frayed. My parents and I, just to finish that thread, we do not speak. We haven't found a way to speak. Part of that is putting up boundaries and understanding, For instance, when you're told you think you're better than us because you have a college degree, and I don't know about you all, but most of the certified assholes I know have things like master's or PhD degrees and stuff. And they're usually the bigger assholes than any of the coal miners that I grew up around in certain ways. It's just this perspective in rural America that to leave maybe suggests to someone who felt like they had to stay, maybe I should have taken a risk and done that too. And that is a hard reality right now. Because as economies shrink, as rural America continues to be plundered and is sold a short list of goods about what it is good for, we are living in, I think, increasingly dangerous times with the anger that people are feeling in places. And normally, since they can't strike out to people who might be impacting their lives, powerful men who are lining their pocketbooks by plundering the prairie, for instance, they'll strike out against people who are different from them. And we are now living in that moment, if we ever weren't. But to my mind of traveling through rural America and I was talking to Craig, who works here at the library, and he's originally from West Virginia, and I said, it's probably my favorite state to visit because it's so stunningly beautiful. But West Virginia is being sold a short list of goods because it's blowing up its mountains. But if you don't know your history, at the turn of the 20th century, it was one of the most socialist states. There were the coal mine wars going on, where coal miners revolted, is where the term redneck comes from, because socialist rebelling coal miners wore red bandanas around their necks to strike against the coal mine barons. At the same time, in my home state, North Dakota had the Nonpartisan League. God, the idea that North Dakota was a socialist state just makes my little Nordic heart weep, because now it's a very fascist red state. There's the State Bank of North Dakota, the state elevator, the state grain mill. It's incredible what was done at the turn of the 20th century and how quickly that narrative has changed. And I just have to hope, maybe not through a book like this, but through other stories, different stories, that we can correct this horrific narrative that I'm putting out there for you all. And I hope we're getting ready for some questions to come my way. But that there can be more stories about what restoration might look like, because I have not yet found them. But it is a bad thing to grow up in a place devoid of stories that suggest life might be possible in this place without destroying it. I think I'll take a breath there, and I know there are mics down front, and I would love any sort of response or anything you'd like to ask me. I love a good challenge, or anything you'd like to ask about this book, or anything else we should talk about, please.
I'd like to introduce a conversation. It just kind of gets overlooked when you talk about rural America. I'm talking about rich farmers.
Sure.
Farmers that send their kids to college.
Yeah.
Now, it's usually ag colleges, and
Yes.
they're indoctrinated in agricultural attitudes.
Yes.
And they're very, very conservative.
Sure.
But they're also not stupid either. They're not uneducated.
Yes.
The Farm Bureau, which I don't know if you're familiar with the Farm Bureau, and people like that, Future Farmers of America.
Yes.
If you talk to an FFA kid, he's no moron. He
Right.
knows what's going on and everything. They're conservative, very conservative, very protective of their women folk, by the way.
Yes.
But what I'm asking is, how do you, these folks who are landowners,
Yes.
3,000 acres, soybean people and things like that, certainly not victims, not coal miners or
Yeah.
workers. They're actually, they employ hired help. They worry, they say, well, hired help don't work and blah, blah, blah. But I also don't like the banker that's pushing me to kill
Sure.
my livestock personally. I would also offer, most farmers have never actually killed an animal.
Sure.
And when they had to, they didn't really particularly like it. My question is, how do you do the wealthy top of the food chain in the rural society, who are not uneducated.
Yes.
By and large, they're educated in rural, colleges like that. What about them? And that's a very open-ended question.
Yeah.
But how do the rich, well-to-do farmers who are well-educated, how do they figure in what you're talking about?
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you for that question, too. I'm the grandson of a farmer who was very poor, partly because when my grandpa was farming, beginning in the 40s, retiring in the 80s, as we had made the countryside safe for machinery. As we've taken a large amount of people off of the land and now forced debt upon farmers and things like this. Most farms, you'll see just on today's drive, most corn and soybean fields are commercial because they have these things I like to call tiny billboards. They're advertising that they're growing seeds by large corporations. But the practices of most farmers in America right now, I wouldn't even call it farming. I would call it winnowing topsoil, which we need to grow our food. We don't have a regenerative agriculture. There isn't an agriculture right now that produces topsoil, which we need to grow our food. It's why I won't swim in the Missouri River or the Mississippi, because there's so much nitrate runoff coming from Iowa and the breadbasket. Most farmers grow biodiesel now. They don't grow food. You get that through local CSA, small independent farmers. But these rich, wealthy farmers are sending, I got my graduate degree from Iowa State. You might as well call it Monsanto University. Charles Grassley. Right, exactly. Chuck Grassley. Let's hope he's done, but he's not running. I mean, he is running still.
Probably will be really.
Yes, that's right. But in these strong agriculture, it's not agriculture, because as Wendell says, there is no culture. It's predicated on destruction, which is an extractive economy. We have to devoid farming, good husbandry, from extractive economies. And modern American agriculture is extractive. Even if people are wealthy, they're wealthy for a short period. That topsoil is, I had a buddy who teaches Native American literature out in Connecticut, is from northeastern North Dakota. He was just back home the other week, and big windstorm kicking up. All that topsoil was blown away. And that is a scary foretaste of the feast to come.
Sir, I'm sorry if you would step up to the mic so that the people at home can hear you.
Yeah, thank you for that reminder.
Anybody else? Wendell Berry, while I was coming here today, I saw a debate between Wendell Berry and Earl Butz.
Oh, sure, yeah, that old one.
That was fascinating, and I recommend that to anybody.
Yeah.
Earl Butz, which most progressives consider really evil, which he very well may be, grew up on a small farm.
Right.
And he saw his father pushed around by larger farmers, and so he got the idea that farmers, he wasn't necessarily pushing corporate agriculture, he wanted farmers to get rich and powerful.
Yes,
At
right.
any cost.
Yes, yeah.
Grow corn, whatever you have to do.
Yes.
And I talked to a lot of farmers, and they said, I'm sorry I have to do what I do.
Of course.
But I had this land for 7 generations.
Yes.
And I'll do whatever I have to
keep it.
Make sure that
Yes.
I'm not the one that blew it. So
yes.
The Earl Butz vision of agriculture come true.
Yes.
And Berry's did not.
No,
unfortunately.
No. Yeah, Wendell will tell you
whatever.
he's lost.
But Butz won the war.
Yes.
But Butz grew up on a small farm. And I think that's important to keep in mind. A lot of these guys who are the so-called bad guys, and they may be, actually are real country people.
Sure. No.
Butz was a country boy.
Yeah.
You cannot. So he was fake. He wasn't. He was what he was. But they won the war, and progressives were pushed out of the country.
Yeah.
What was it, Chom Daschle? He used to, he's gone. He's out. And off they go. But like I say, that's all I got to say. But just talk about the wealthier class of rural people that I think gets lost in the rural-urban talk.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's part of this big land grab, as my friend Mary Swander, the former poet laureate of Iowa, illustrates so incredibly. Right now, in the next 10 years, we're under a huge land transition in this country. that basically the amount of land is sized to the Louisiana Purchase that will be going through farming transfers at this point, which is prime for corporate buy-offs. But what you're suggesting, in my way of hearing it, is similar to, though I'm not addressing agriculture in my book, it's a difference by degree. It's an extractive economy, which means it's predicated on removing people from, I mean, let's be clear, farming, the only reason people are on the land still is because we haven't fully automated it. I mean, once that happens, people will be gone, just like with coal mining or fossil fuels. I mean, the logical outcome of industrial capitalism is human irrelevance. I mean, that is what we're in right now.
It looks
Sir,
like we have another over here. Please, sir.
Thank you.
Good evening, my name's Jim, and
Nice
I was
to meet
just
you,
wondering if you might tell us a little bit more about your contemporary life and how you
Yeah.
transitioned to a more supportive and inclusive
Yes.
and empowering community that has given you the platform to write a book and
Thank you.
speak about yourself.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Jim, for that question. I mean, so when I was living in the Twin Cities, after I got outed and dropped out of seminary, I went to a very progressive Lutheran church that performed its first same-sex wedding, and I got to be the little assisting minister. All I did was like hold the binder for the pastor, but I got to be right there when Kevin and Will said, "I do." And to me, it felt so risky. Kevin and Will invited the entire congregation, and the entire congregation came. It was incredible. Kevin was probably close to 50-ish. Will was probably 45. Will is now dead after dying from cancer, unfortunately. They're in this book. Kevin's parents didn't come, but Will's mother did from Kansas. And when they were doing the rehearsal, they're both very shy men. She yelled out, "Now you boys say I do so everyone here can hear it." That is something that's buoyed me. Deep friendships. Part of what is hard about this book, as some readers have written to me, they said, "Oh, we so thought your parents were going to come back around." Well, because isn't that what we want in our stories? Great separation and great reclamation. For me, that's not true. I mean, one of the hard things I think this book shows is, in fact, love is conditional. When we say love is unconditional, I would say I don't write about that. It's just sort of under the surface. But I think when we say love is unconditional, what we forget is that we're actually choosing every day to love unconditionally. And that is a choice. If my parents still love me, their version of love is something I can't fathom. And it's quite violent, to be honest. And so part of what I've had to do, not only through therapy, but is to finally admit, just because you begin your life's journey with people does not mean that they get to come along for the entirety of it. That is not easy. But I mean, that is part of writing this book, is to not romanticize. I mean, to come out or to be outed is not without risk. But this transcends being LGBTQ+. This is having the bravery to not put up with abuse. You don't write sentences that sing if you're being abused. You're trying to survive. We have these great romantic notions, you know, Tchaikovsky is writing his grand symphonies when he's in the throes of being suicidal. That's just not true. If you're suicidal, you either kill yourself or you get out of bed and write a great symphony. I mean, it's a little more nuanced than that, but let's be clear. To romanticize creating brilliant things out of the depths of, that does not happen. Faulkner only wrote when he was sober. It was the rest of the time that he was drunk. And we forget those things. So part of it, to your question, Jim, is to find the people that not only love you unconditionally, to choose that, but in another way, it's to stop and to refuse to be continuously gaslit, that there's something wrong with you. You need to go to therapy to fix that, by which I mean conversion therapy. That is part of how you, I think, at least for me, this is the place I always get put in, is trying to prescribe. I can only really speak for me. And somehow I didn't kill myself, though in the book you'll see a number of suicide attempts. And so how does that happen? I think it's luck. I don't want to romanticize it. Why am I here and some other gay little boy isn't?
We have a question online.
Yeah.
Someone wrote on YouTube that's sort of similar to that. What can the average person do to make rural communities more welcoming for LGBTQ youth?
I think visibility matters a lot.
Representation by adults who are from that community?
That, or just, just on Netflix last week, I watched a documentary called, what is it? Keep Sweet, or something about the fundamentalist Latter-day Saints movement. And, or I watched that, but then the one I mean to say is on Hulu. It's called Mormon No More. And it's a quite interesting transformational story about queer Latter-day Saints and then parents who were resistant. And this one mother of a lesbian bought rainbow pins that they then wear to church just to signal. It's these quiet ways to signal, I'm a safe person. For me, I just finished teaching, giving up a tenure-track job at a college in the South that's the 11th most conservative student body in the country. And I flew a big pride flag on the front of my door. I just wanted people to know. I mean, that doesn't mean just because you're queer you should come to me. It just means I'm hopefully a safe person for whatever you're going through. I mean, as much as I wish everyone was a queer person, and not everyone unfortunately is, but that I want people who are dealing with, racism or sexism to know that I'm a safe person. And I think part of it, if we're going to be good allies and good community members, then people need to finally become, pardon me, fucking brave. People who have it easy tend to not speak up. And that I just don't understand. I mean, I'm just tiny and tired and lazy. But I'm just out here trying to just be like, please, let's not be certified assholes to people. And I think part of that is having conversations. I had a great uncle who was gay. I had a great aunt who was a lesbian. I love going to Pride or things like this. I think when those conversations are in the air, particularly queer youth, and then I'll come to you, please. The thing I want to say, wrap this up, just so we're all on the same page. Last year, the Trevor Project, that studies the mental health landscape of LGBTQ youth, not only is it suicidal ideation up, they just released their most recent study that last year in this country, 45% of LGBTQ youth contemplated killing themselves. That number is higher amongst trans youth and BIPOC, that is communities of color who identify as queer. I get goosebumps when I share that with you. I mean, that's part of what a little book is trying to do, is to get Garrett to take the gun out of his mouth, or to get little Susie to loosen the noose and to say, stay. And part of that is to be a good ally, is to be open and talk. And that it's more important to keep queer youth around than to worry about what your neighbor, Bob or Susan is going to think of you.
You spoke about the idea of monoculture, and I know you said your book isn't about agriculture.
But we could talk about it.
Sure, it's a great metaphor for what our country's going through. We're close to the Land Institute, the idea of trying to regenerate.
Yes, West Jackson.
Yeah, some sort of prairie life.
Yes.
But it seems more increasingly that that's something that can't exist in our current America again. But do you see the prairie or that ecosystem as offering some sort of potential metaphor or roadmap to a more regenerative life for our culture as a whole? Yeah,
thank you for that question. That's what I hope this book is articulating, is that the prairie thrives in diversity. How is it that we've gotten a monoculture of thinking? That's an insult to the landscape that I love. I mean, most people think North Dakota in fall is brown. It's not brown. It's umber, it's ochre, it's sienna. We don't even know our language to describe the prairie in its full resplendent glory. And it seems to me that people who remain, how is it that I had to flee the landscape I love so much, and people who believe they live in God's country make their living by destroying it? That's blasphemy, as I learned growing up in the church. People would knock my teeth out if I said that in Oliver County to their face, but it just seems to me patently true. So what is it that we need to create diversity on the prairie? The prairie, if we're talking about people, in North Dakota is about all I can speak about, has historically been diverse, though it might not be in number. Black people have been in North Dakota as long as people who look like me. We don't hear those stories. I never grew up with those narratives. What does it mean to reclaim some of these narratives, to share them more widely? It doesn't mean that a place is safe. I'm not suggesting that. But if, as Howard Zinn said, we don't know our history, it's as if we're born yesterday. And the work of the Land Institute is important. There is also an idea, though, that Wes Jackson has put out that the main major in American education is upward mobility, which I agree with. And he would say that what we need is a major in homecoming. I don't agree with that, unless we're talking about a queer homecoming. Home was a very dangerous, not my physical home, but that town of 600, I knew I had to get out. So when we're talking about a grand Jeffersonian way of thinking, we have to remember that Jeffersonian agriculture was predicated on enslaving people and reproductive free labor. And so there's part of that. I mean, your question is so important. It's one that keeps me up at night, and I don't have that answer yet. I hope my book gets us closer to say, this is not working if we're promoting systems where lakes never freeze, for instance. We need something different. And I don't yet have that answer, but I hope somewhere out here others do, because I think it is many of us. It is not one person. That is what the prairie has taught me. We need a choir of diverse voices to move us towards something that's more holistic and regenerative rather than destructive.
And we have time for one more question.
Yes, please. Thank you.
Okay, thanks for coming. It seems like you're about 35 or 40 years old.
I'm 34, so you're almost right on the head, yeah.
Have you found your soulmate yet?
No, I haven't. Still looking if you want to, put out a call there.
And it seems like you got out of town before you really got bullied.
No, no. I'm sorry if I gave that it definitely got called a word that rhymes with tag and begins with an F. And
okay.
Yeah.
And the last question is, does North Dakota have seed banks for original corn and wheat and all
goodness. That, I'm so sorry. I don't know the answer to that, but I'll look into that. I would hope it would, but I do not know. So.
Well, thank you all very much for being here tonight.
Thank you all
for
making
coming.
time.
And we'd love for everyone to come on out into the lobby, and I think that you'll be signing books out in the lobby. Thank you all for coming tonight.